Thanks for coming to the first session of our 2010 Working in the Mill History Series, sponsored by the Bonner Area History Roundtable. I think Sharon's getting everybody to sign up, but please do sign up because we want to keep you informed of what's going on out here. I would invite you on the back of your program to take a look at the calendar. Next week, there's an interesting program on saving historic building materials, and Gary Delp actually deconstructed some of those buildings at the mill, also took the windows out of the powerhouse. So it's going to be an interesting program over at the Lutheran Church at 2 next Sunday. And then our next meeting will be February 21st, third Sunday, and we're going to have a really good program to be announced. So without further ado, I would like to introduce a special guest today who has a very exciting announcement that's of real significance to Bonner. Dan Hall of Western Cultural.
Thanks, Judy.
Would you speak into the microphone, please?
I don't do microphones.
Okay.
Yesterday, I went to Helena for the State Historic Preservation Office Review Board quarterly meeting, and I defended the Bonner Company Town Historic District. And I'm glad to say that we now have a new historic district. The nomination was accepted unanimously. The National Register of Historic Places recognizes those historic sites, buildings, and districts that are significant to our country. There are 4 categories of properties that can be listed on the National Register. We have properties that are eligible at the local level, at the state level, at the national level, and then we have National Historic Landmarks. As an example, Missoula County Courthouse is eligible for the National Register at the local level, and Bonner is eligible to the National Register of Historic Places for its national significance. Thank you.
We owe a great debt of gratitude to Dan. He did a fabulous job, and I hope you'll all stop by the History Center at some point and read the information he put together about Bonner. It's just fascinating. Okay, moving on to our program now. I don't really need to introduce Glenn, but all of you know him already, but this is something that we've been taught that you don't say, oh, you know how that goes, because we're supposed to be collecting historic information. So I'm going to turn the program over to Glenn Smith, and take it away.
Okay. Okay, can you all hear me? Okay, hang on to your seats. As I look out over the group, I'm pleased to see a lot of the, I grew up out here at Bonner, but I see a lot of other kids out here. I see a whole row back there. Mr. Walker, Marie, right? Okay, her picture was in the paper here just the other day. Okay, Donna, I haven't seen her yet, but anyway, there was a whole bunch of us out here, and about that time, I was probably one of those kids that was getting booted out because, you little bugger, get the hell out of here, we're trying to make a movie. But I got some great memories from that. First thing I'd like to point out, it seemed like with old number 7, Jim, how are you? With old number 7 right here, whenever we done something major at the mill, number 7 got something done to it. Right after we built the big square building that sits right by the highway, that thing was brought out of mothballs, and Bill Rux, right here, sitting in our audience, he was on one of the crews that scraped the paint on that, chipped it, done his best to make sure that thing looked really good, because we were going to move it up to the park up here, and where the old Margaret Hotel sat. So Bill was on the first crew there that cleaned that up. The second crew that come along consisted of Ernie Stroll, Mutt Tagg, Bill Kurtz, Bill Bader, Emmanuel Riegel. And I'm sure some of you can remember how that move was made, but if not, I'll kind of refresh your memory. They used 3 sets of rails. One rail sat directly under the engine and tender. One set of rails, which is all bolted to the track and everything, sat in the front. Third set sat behind. So what they did was they took a Caterpillar, a road maintainer, and a pettibone, and they tugged and they pushed and turned that thing from all the way down by about where the plywood plant sits, between there and the machine shop, all the way up to the park. And Ernie stated that the road maintainer and the Caterpillar were used to pull, but that bulldozer had a little bit of problem on the asphalt. They'd like to sit there and just spin. So they wanted to have to put tires under the tracks, and that turned allowed it to be moved. Ernie would use that pettibone. They would unbolt a section of track. He'd pick it up with pettibone, move it around to the front of the engine. They'd bolt it back up and they'd shove it another track length. And that's the process they used until they got it all the way up to the park. Let's see, Shorty. He probably remembers this because we had to check the equipment out from Shorty to make sure that that engine was shoved up there. So I see Shorty in the audience also. Now, it sat up there for a long, long time, and it took us a short time, it seemed like. I guess it was over 20 years. We ate up our big lumber supply, our big log supply, and we had to tear that mill down, rebuild it. So it came back as a stud mill. And of course, guess what happened to number 7? Good old number 7 here was decided to be moved to Fort Missoula. At that time, they took it out of it. They had a little fence around that. Took the fence down, and they moved that old locomotive down using, first of all, they had to pull the drive shaft out of it. Then they uncoupled the tender from the locomotive. And we had a fellow out here, his name was Danny Lake. I imagine he still works for hauling MRL equipment, but he had a special truck and trailer. It had railroad tracks welded right to the bed of that trailer. And that particular unit was used to hold the tender. And I think the smokestack went with that. Okay, the second rig, and this was a monster. For all you truckers, you probably think, oh, hell, that's just an everyday thing. But to me, it was big. This thing was owned by Dennis McKinney. He was from Anaconda. And when he came to Bonner, he arrived with this thing. It was 135 feet in length, 50 tires under it, with an estimated load capacity of about 130,000 pounds. So, to me, that seemed kind of ironic, because back in the day, this was the only way you moved logs out of the hills. And to suggest that a truck could do that brought a lot of snickers from some old timers. The end of the line for this old machine here saw it right on the back of a truck to Fort Missoula. Okay, on the trip out there, Dennis stated that he said he got some real strange looks. Truckers driving down the road. What in the devil is that thing, you know? So he said that he had to go clear to the Y out there in order to turn it around to head back to the fort. So he had to take the westbound lane out, turn it out there at the Y, come down the eastbound lane, and get off so he could get to the fort. So that's how it was moved the second time, and that's where it is now. And Mac Palmer is in charge of that. He's right here. He is probably the most authoritative man that I have seen in a long time on Shea engines. Now, Shays, you can't really call them all Shays. It's like an analogy to make for that is, you see a truck going down the highway with a load of logs on. It's a logging truck. But it could be a Kenworth, it could be a Peterbilt. In this case, this was a Willamette Shea. And the other shays that we had were Limas, made in Lima, Ohio. Okay, kind of clarify that. Yeah, we can go through and I'll kind of describe these. Here's the unit itself.
Yeah, just the road lights off. Yeah, we can lights off.
Okay. Better? All right. There she is on this thing I call a monster. 135 feet, 50 tires. And I believe that is the driver up on the top making some checks. Measuring it to make sure it's going to fit under any bridges or any power lines or anything that might be sticking up. Another shot of her sitting, this is the locomotive part sitting on the truck. Give you an idea. I tried to get a picture of some of the tires. There was enough tires there to start a tire store. Looking the other way from the truck back, you can see Dennis's name on the truck, and you look back, tire, engine, tire. Some other contraption hooked onto the back of that with more tires on it. And then the whole thing was guided down the road with pilot car in front, pilot car in the back. So it got a lot of curious stares from folks as they drove down the road and saw this old unit. So to me, it was kind of sad to see that. This particular shot here now, this is an old one. I think probably a lot of folks have seen this. This is Mr. Ross and the crew. They're sitting up there at McNamara's Landing. Now, if you look close, you'll see this is a Russell type log car. At the time of this picture, we only needed 16-foot logs. So these cars were a little bit smaller than what we see in the latter years of our history. So again, this is McNamara's Landing. This was taken down at the mill, and the old timers referred to this shot here. You can see the cliffs in back of the mill. Okay, this area here was referred to as the Shea Barns, and I'll mention this in the story that I'll tell you about Dan Ryan. So this was actually on our mill site. I'm assuming that this probably was taken on water.
That one is a shade, not Orlando.
Okay, and the small stack, now this, I've noticed on this small stack here, I've seen this picture before with that unit parked in a garage. Evidently, they built a shed just to cover the engine, but the smokestack sat out for obvious reasons. Put the whole thing in the garage, and that smoke's gonna drive you crazy. But they bent it. There's a hell of a dent in the front of that smokestack. So this picture shows up quite a bit in our mill's history. So.
I don't know if you want to look at these now or later.
Okay, let me tell you a story about old Dan Ryan, and then we'll get into the rest of this. I'm kind of putting the cart in the front and the back of the horse here, but to get a real good feel for this, we'll go into Dan Ryan. So Dan, well, first let me back up and go a little further than just Dan. I'm going to talk about myself again, because I kind of like doing that. Anyway, I worked for Champion over here, and Champion had a little weekly, no, it was a monthly newsletter called Tamarack. And they needed a filler story one day. So I jotted up a story about one of the old Shea engines. And Mr. Ed Roberts thought, well, you know, this is pretty cool. This guy, you know, at least he can cross his T, put a dot over the I. So they recruited me into writing for the Tamarack. And as a result of that, I had some great experiences. This experience here that I want to tell you about it occurred. I was sorting through all the old Sheas we had. I got the dates down, when they bought them, how long they operated, when they were scrapped. And I was scratching my head thinking of another story when I got a phone call. And this young lady on the other end of the phone says, my granddad used to run that old Shea. And I thought, oh man, jackpot here. So I got her phone number and address and stuff, and I went up to Beavertail Hill to Orville Spooner. You guys, I see Ike, he remembers Orville. Ed, you probably remember Orville. Bill?
No, I never met him.
You never met Orville? Okay, they invited me into their home, and what an experience that was. They had refreshments, coffee, and for a while there I thought I was a member of the family. They dug out picture albums. I've got one of Dan Ryan himself when he retired, and they proceeds to tell me this fascinating story. So I'll dig into that by saying let's all go back with me to 1936. Franklin Roosevelt's the 32nd president. W.C. Lubrecht is the plant manager. And Dan just landed a job as night watchman. So it's a job. It supports the family. But like most young guys, you see a big old machine out there, you're thinking to yourself, I wonder if I could run that damn thing. And I'm sure that's what Dan thought when he saw these Shays, you know, the Limas and the Willamettes. And again, I'll point out that first Shay was built by Ephraim Shay. He designed that first geared locomotive late 1870s. And that most of the Shays here at Bonner were Limas, with the exception of this one, which was a Willamette. Okay, and that was actually built for the Western Lumber Company, which sat over here where the town pump is. Okay. Another nickname for them were sidewinders, due to the cylinders on the side, 3 cylinders. And if you've ever had the pleasure of listening to one of these things, it's not like a rod engine. You know, this woof, 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 you know, big, powerful, brute sound of things. These little guys were a lot faster because there was 3 cylinders and they were a churning. And back here we'll have the bore diameter and the stroke of that rods in the pistons. So them little guys was really churning. You'll probably see it when we get into the movie part. But anyway, getting back to Dan here, he'd start his career. He finally got over into the Shay barns. Here's his big chance. He's going to start out as a fireman, and he started working under an old engineer called Baldy Crane. Baldy was engineer before Dan here. Okay, eventually Baldy retired, and now's Dan's big chance. He steps up into that driver's seat. This is his baby, and he's going to run it. He ran it for a long time. Now, in some of our pictures we have, as we get down into Timberjack itself, you'll notice that when it comes to the firemen, they've got it listed as fireman unknown. Orville and his wife told me that fireman's name was Highholt. He only had one name, and that was Highholt. And of course, when he got wind that there might be a movie made, he was jacked. He wanted a picture of himself. The reason he wanted this picture, he says, is he wanted to be able to recognize himself in case he ever saw himself. So that was his claim to fame. One of these old timers, and you probably met a lot of them, you know, working out here at the mill and in the woods crews. You know, there were some clowns out here that just kept you in stitches 90% of the time. Highholt was one of them. Okay, they run this old locomotive. They run it out of Chamberlain Creek on Cap 8, and I'm told that's located just across the Scotty Brown Bridge. They hauled the logs from Chamberlain down into Sperry Grade. From there, it was uncoupled from the Shay, or the old Willamette here, and it was hooked onto the Milwaukee. And I know all you guys here in Fourth Row that grew up with me out here remember old 1246. That was a rod engine, I guess, on the sides. That's the one my stepdad, and I will refer to him as stepdad for lack of a better name. He took care of that. So I was pretty familiar with that old engine too, but anyway, that old unit would haul them from there to Bonner, and at Bonner, you can probably remember at night when they would trip those cars loose, the logs hit the river. There was that boom, ba-doom, ba-doom, ba-doom. You'd hear them logs bouncing down the bank, this huge splash when they hit the river. So that was the final destination, Camp 8 or Spring Grade down here to Bonner. Dan also told me that, or not Dan, but his family told me that he'd spent a lot of time in these logging camps. And he was a family man, so he missed his family. And of course, when it came time for the weekend, usually he made the trip back down here to Bonner and spent the time with his family. So this was the lifestyle he lived, and as the years passed, like all of us, myself included, the gray hair slipped in. What didn't slip in fell out. And it's time for him to retire. He's about 62 now. And when he decided this is it, he walked into Don McKenzie's office, laid his axe on the desk and says, "That's it. I'm finished." So it was pretty plain to everybody that Dan wanted to retire. He paid his dues. He wanted out. He wanted to kick back, enjoy the good life. So this came to as a shock. Most of these old timers, they were expected, or at least thought of, you work until you can't work no more. You keel over, you're gone, we'll haul you out and put somebody else in. So they thought old Dan had another good 10 years on him. Totally shocked why he wanted to retire. So good old Highholt, he didn't want to be outdone. He says, "By golly," he says, "I think I'll retire too." I says, "Well, what do you mean you can't retire?" "Oh yeah," he says, "I'm old enough to retire." He says, "Well, how old are you?" Well, he says, "I don't know. Born Sweden, I come over here, I don't know." So they says, "Well, you kind of look old enough, we'll retire you." A later record showed that he was actually 75 when he retired. Okay, so now they're out to pasture, and I've kind of lost track. I don't know of anybody that can tell me stories about them until the Hollywood film crew came to town. Republic Pictures, about 1954. Am I letting the cat out of the bag on some of our ages? We were kids then, so we'll let it go at that, huh? Okay, there were some great stories. I think Jimmy recalls one time of a fight they had up there that wasn't going quite right. Told the stuntmen to take a poke at some of these mill workers, liven them up. Let's get some realism here. Well, they livened them up. That fight was glorious. So here's Dad's chance. Here's Highholt's chance. Man, Hollywood's in town. We got movie actors. We got all this stuff. We're going to make us a movie, and I get to drive old number 7 again. So him and Highholt, they fired the old rascal up. And about the only hitch that I know of that came from that was Dan, the character of the movie script. The engineer had to wear a mustache. And Dan says, "Ain't no way that's going to happen." So when you see the pictures of him sitting in the engine with that Hollywood crew, there's no mustache on his face. He wouldn't have any part of that. So I guess to wind this story down, what a fitting way for this old engine to go into retirement is through that movie with Dan and Highholt at the throttle. And of course, it's kind of corny, as you'll find out. The script's kind of corny. But with that, we'll kind of just lead into the movie itself. Is there many here that's actually seen that more than once, that old movie? You? Okay, you'll probably, what we want to do is see if you can recognize some of the scenes from this movie, where they were filmed at.
You want to take a couple minutes? We got coffee, cookies, maybe not.
Now, you need to tell me where you want me to stop it.
We've been kind of pirated, I think. Double from one copy to another.
Familiar territory to most of you?
Okay, this ought to be familiar. Okay, well, that's Bonner, now we're at McIntyre's.
Who's the guy in white?
Sterling Hayden. Marie, you took a picture with Sterling, didn't you? Cool. Max Analoli, they're having a confrontation here. David Bryan here.
Didn't hurt you, did it?
You again.
Yeah, he's a tough guy.
You want to fast forward to the next scenes with the railroad, or what?
Yeah, this here, we're thinking probably was filmed up Summers. This probably a Hollywood movie set. You'll see that she's in a dance hall singing. The plot is they're going to steal this Shea locomotive, the Willamette, they're going to haul it to Blackwood. She's in the saloon across the tracks, making a distraction so that they can sneak that engine up the track. In reality, if you look at that, it was part of it was filmed inside the old car repair shop set over here by Petros. The saloon would have had to have sat up on the side of the mountain. There's no way that would fit in there, but the way they hooked that up, you swore, they were just a hooping and a hollering and, get tanked up while the engine was being stolen. When you look, the first time I saw that, blew me away. I actually had to go down there and touch that cliff to see, am I seeing things here or what? Okay. Had a lot of fun with that fellow. I had a cross-butt dog. He tried to buy that from me. He whipped out a $10 bill and I damn near sold that dog. And he probably told me, I'm just jerking your chain, heck with it. Also, I think for those who remember Francis the Talking Mule, he was the voice for that character. Adolphe Monjou, they call him Silky. If you watch this movie at its original soundtrack, keep your eye on Silky's hat. That's a big part of how this plot unfolds. Silky's hat.
For those of you who are unfamiliar, as I was when I saw this, there's a dispute over who's going to have the rights to log all this timber, which is why they steal the train so that they can bring the timber out. So.
There we go. That's my favorite shot right there. That's a rare shot, the way we used to be.
Some of that steam coming off the side indicates that engine was not in the best of shape.
That's a movie. Just run it. There's Dan. Okay, these were part of the repair shops set right over here by Petros.
Diana Hendricks was telling me Hoagie Carmichael must have been really personable because he came into their house and played their piano when they lived over in Bonner. They also had a little terrier dog, and of course people didn't keep their dogs tied up, and it kept running through the set, and her folks kept getting all of these complaints from the director, get that dog out of here.
And there's information on the back table. It's possible to buy a DVD of this film now. I'm running off of a VHS copy that was made off the air.
A lot of the townspeople show up on a daily basis, kind of watch what's going on.
As I recall, they did.
Some of the stories that they were telling, they'd go to McNamara's Landing to watch or whatever. Then they'd go to the movie and those scenes ended up on the cutting room floor. So a lot of the stuff that we'd love to see is probably long gone.
Well, they filmed it in broad daylight, but in the movie it was nighttime.
Is that right?
Yeah, they had filters.
Most
in
of,
the
yeah,
cameras.
most of the night scenes are filmed during the
During the
day.
bright daylight.
You can often see the sky in the background.
So where would this be about? I mean, I don't know if that's a Hollywood water tower or not.
I think that was up Belmont.
His railroad retirement didn't cover this.
All right, look at there. Take a close look at the smokestack on this unit as compared to our old Willamette.
Was that a different train?
That was a different unit there, yeah.
Okay. I was gonna ask you where that landing was, but obviously they could have shot that somewhere else.
Yeah, it was a whole different engine and everything. Okay, here we are back in Bonner again. This right
That
down
is
here.
the Willamette. Those
Yeah.
square boxes there was the giveaway.
You know, the second time I saw this was at the Loma Theater. And when this guy was shot at the end, that whole audience cheered and clapped. You could tell they did not like him.
That was the character he was up to play it. Now, Ollie's having a little disagreement.
Yeah, they're having a parting of the ways here. You know, that's another interesting part of our history. Now, Scandinavian folks worked out here, the French, Tippinoes, all those. There was a bunch of different nationalities out here, kind of like a big melting pot. And they bring that out pretty clear in the movie here, too.
Logs must go through.
There's McNamara's.
The big stack is all full of screens to catch as many of the cinders as possible to prevent setting the woods on fire, because this is a coal-burning locomotive. Now, that's still a Willamette.
Yeah, but it gained a number.
Yeah, they changed the number, but that's still the one that we have here now.
Yeah, I think the Milwaukee Railroad they wanted recognition too, so they did have one of their emblems or logos they put on there.
Where's this at? Anybody got a reckon?
I can't recall this one.
It's like up around Gold Creek somewhere. Just below McNamara maybe?
I'll be guessing.
I'm guessing.
This is where they find Swifty's body. That's still the Willamette. You see those square boxes up above his head?
Cylinder
And that's
trim?
the teller, because I can point that out with some of the books and pictures in the back if people are interested. But even though it's got the number 17 on it, it's the locomotive that's still here. Are these all actors or some of these local folks in these scenes?
To my knowledge, that's part of their crew. It's mainly those guys are playing the part of French loggers.
This
Yeah.
is the kind of scene where they frequently do use extras, so you might see locals.
If anybody sees a good old Bonner boy, sing out.
Where are you at, Glenn?
He's at home with his
They won't let
dog.
me play.
Yeah. He wouldn't sell his dog, they threw him off the set.
That's it. Yeah, this is not here. There's a big steam ram that takes them, pushes them off the cars.
I wonder if that's West Side lumber.
Yeah, it's nothing like we had around here.
Yeah, it might be in Washington. There's an engine 7 in there.
Good sized logs too.
Is that your dog, Glenn?
Oh, my dog didn't like that one. This one could drink beer with the best of them, so. Somebody offers buy him a beer.
Drink beer 2 times?
Is during the scenes with his father when they're discussing the floating of the logs, that somebody utters the immortal line, "We'll have the biggest champagne party this side of Missoula."
Yeah, true.
I wonder if it's any bigger now than it was then.
Oh, it is. Oh, so it's the Summers then, probably.
That's, my guess is that it was
Oh,
Summers, but I
okay.
don't know.
Right, okay.
That's the one that used to be up there. That's Flathead.
Hey, you're right, yeah, that's it. Wow.
Oh,
Yeah.
right, hotel is now.
Oh, okay. And this area's at, or is this down at the mill?
This is not our mill, but that same sign,
Okay.
it was placed up by the bridge here. When you see the engine going across the
Sure.
bridge, you'll see Tulka Logging Company right by the bridge there.
I remember as a little kid, up there where the big white steer is, they loaded logs up there. What was the name of that land?
I wish Dennis was here. Mike, do you know what they call that landing up there by Clearwater Resort?
Clearwater
Landing.
Clearwater,
Yeah.
Clearwater Landing.
Is that what they call that?
That's Glacier.
You'll notice he managed to walk back Meredith Glacier by going over the.
Did they take that engine up there on the truck too?
Yes.
Oh, this made it on its own power.
Out of the 17, that is the 7 that we have.
They just add a 1 to the 7 that was
already there.
Yeah, I think that's what happened there.
That's good old Hollywood for you.
Yeah. But you know, the thing I like about this is the fact that, you know, we get a chance to see just what that old machine could do. It's a little bit far-fetched in places, but it is kind of a window into our past.
It's like St. Mary's.
And they sold a lot of lots in Sealy Lake on this film. That's Sealy Lake, you betcha. Gotta get to get out. Yeah. Ah, please.
Does anyone know Bob Cushman? Works for Heritage Printing here in Missoula. He's about my age, and I'm 70. He must be about 68. But I notice on these posters, and I've known Bob since he was a freshman in college, but on these posters, it says down here in fine print, based on a novel by Dan Cushman. Anyone ever remember Dan Cushman? Stay away, Joe. Anyone else remember any other things about Dan Cushman?
Plenty of room and air.
What?
Plenty of room and air was another.
Plenty of room and air. I remember as a college student back in the around 1960, he came to the university once or twice and spoke about, spoke to, a meeting of townsfolk and students about his writing career, and he was from Great Falls. And his son came to Missoula and went to college and didn't graduate, and eventually started working for me, and I was a photographer here in Missoula, and I taught him how to use a Nikon camera. And living with me was a fellow named Harley Heddick, who was a Missoulian photographer, and they needed a new photographer at the Missoulian, so Bob Cushman said, well, I can operate a Nikon camera. He didn't really know how to do anything with the camera except copy pictures out of books for me. And so he got hired as a Missoulian photographer, Bob Cushman did, and then he got hired at the university to teach photography to journalism students. Even though he didn't have a degree from college, they sort of had him into the journalism school under sort of special provision. And then he went to work in Missoula years ago for Heritage Printing, and I think he still works for Heritage Printing. Is that right, Judy? Yes. And so that's a local connection with your movie. And I didn't know that Dan Cushman had anything to do with the movie until about an hour ago when I walked in here. What?
Wasn't there a Cushman that wrote for the Great Falls Tribune?
A Cushman that wrote for the Great Falls Tribune. Does anyone know? Whether he worked for the Great Falls Tribune, I don't know. I just thought he just wrote books and had some things made into movies.
Thank you. That speaker is Doug Grimm. I'd like to introduce Mac now, who does interpretation of the locomotive out at the fort, and he's going to tell us a little bit more about our train.
The thing I want to say about this locomotive, people keep calling it a Shay, and it is indeed a Shay design. But the Shay locomotives were built by the Lima Works in Lima, Ohio, and they built nearly 3,000 of them. In the late teens, when the patents were beginning to die on the Shays, the Willamette Iron and Steel Company in Portland, Oregon, which was building logging equipment and had repaired several steam locomotives, including Shays, decided to build one of a similar design but with several improvements. And I mentioned during the film, there's 3 square boxes, and you can see some of these details in some books I have at the back. Those are the valve chambers at the top of the cylinders. And on a Willamette, and this was one of their particular features of improvement, they all face out so they can be worked on easily. On a Shay, the forward 2 valve chambers face forward, and the rear one faces to the rear and is inside the edge of the cab. It takes up some of the edge of the cab, which is a way that you can look at it very closely and see it. The other thing I want to say about the locomotive that's mostly in here, and maybe is all of these scenes in spite of the change of numbers, it was the only coal-burning locomotive built by the Willamette Company. They started in the business of building locomotives kind of late, and they only built 33 locomotives. They built 32 oil burners and 1 coal-burning locomotive, and that's the one that's here. That big stack, it's called a Radley and Hunter stack. In the days when they were building a lot of locomotives, there was enough business. There was a company that just built the stacks, and they were called Radley and Hunter, and it's filled with a whole bunch of screens in order to catch the cinders, because in the woods you don't need hot cinders falling out of the locomotive. On the main line, it's cleared off to the side pretty well, so that there's not so much of a problem. If you look at the locomotive down at Circle Square with a straight stack, It's also a coal-burning locomotive. It would also be putting cinders out, but the right-of-way is cleared so you're not so likely to set something on fire. The number 7 is actually the construction number. It was the 7th locomotive to be built by the Willamette Company. It carried the number 3 which was the operating number of it when it worked for Western Lumber and for Heron. But then they put the 7 as the operating number when it started to work for the Anaconda Company or Big Blackfoot. And I've got a book back here with information on all of the Willamette locomotives. The very last one to be built was rebuilt by the Mount Rainier Scenic Railroad at Mineral, Washington, and went back into operating condition on the 8th of July of last year. So one of the 6 that still remains is in operating condition now. Of the 33 that were built, 6 of them still exist. And other than the one that's operating over at Mineral now, the one we have here is the most complete. Essentially everything is there except the gauges and a couple of things that were taken off. Perhaps were stolen and perhaps are put away somewhere. They would be if they were left out. The other thing I'd like to say is I have the keys to the cab, and I would be delighted to have people come over to Fort Missoula and take you into the cab and show you the controls of it, talk about the details of that particular locomotive. It's a unique one since it was the only coal burner the company built. There were 3 types of geared steam locomotives. The most common were the Shays, and there were nearly 3,000 of them built. Willamette built one of a very similar design and built only 33. The next most common one was called a Climax, and it had 2 inclined cylinders on the outside that drove the center shaft, and they drove all axles through a center gear. The last one was the Heisler, and it had 2 inclined cylinders that went in toward the center and drove a center shaft, and it was geared to only 1 axle in each truck, and then it had side rods on it like a regular locomotive to drive the other axle. So all 3 of these types of locomotives drove all axles, drove all wheels.
I got a question.
Yes.
You know more than I about trains, but wasn't the 1959, this movie's of 1955, in 1959, wasn't that the end of the era of steam locomotives? They went to diesel in 59?
Well, the very first of the diesels actually were beginning to come in mostly in switcher use before World War II. And then during the war, there were very few diesels built. The diesel engines that were being built went into submarines. And some new steam locomotives, the big boy on the Union Pacific, those were built during World War II between 1941 and 1944. The Norfolk and Western Railway continued to build steam locomotives into the 50s. I believe the last one they built maybe was as late as 59. And they used steam locomotives in mainline service longer than any other railroad. But by the mid-50s, diesels were more numerous than the steam, and steam was being removed. One of the big reasons for this was that for an hour on the railroad, a steam engine tended to need about 3 hours of maintenance work for every hour of operation. And you had to have personnel to keep it hot all night if you were going to run it the next day, whereas a diesel, you can turn it off and turn it back on. Actually, many years ago, I was a diesel mechanic in the military railway service in the early 50s. But steam is still a thing I like, in spite of having made my living on diesels for a while. Anything else?
Does anyone know when the last started stuff being floated down the Blackfoot?
Yeah, I'm not sure the last actual log drive in its entirety. I know we dumped them in the river out here at the landings. We dumped them in the river. Ed, do you remember how long we dumped those logs in the river? I know it was into the 50s. In the 50s. So, and there, if you look in the river now, you can see loss and recovery. We paid a lot of guys to cut a lot of logs. We never made a board out of.
Do you
They're all
know if
laying
any
out
more
there.
of these logs are gonna be picked up along the river?
I heard say that some furniture outfits want those.
I think this summer, there'll be about 5,000 more taken. There was a grant that was just approved to, they took out, I'm asking Mike and Studia, 5,000 about last year and another 5,000 coming up during low water. I think the last log drive floating totally down the river from Clearwater was in 1926. Stan,
Got 3 quick things to talk about.
come on up. This is Stan Cohen. He's got a lot to say about Timberjack. He knew some of the actors. And
I brought all these posters over here. I actually have what was called a 3-sheet, which is 7 feet by 4 feet, but I couldn't get it in my car. But these are basically the posters that were made. The small ones are 6 lobby cards. The one that's framed is actually an Australian poster, so they made them in different countries. Just a couple quick things. For you that don't know, Sterling Hayden, actually during World War II, was in the OSS, mainly in Yugoslavia. And of course, he was a sea captain, you said, and a very adventurous person. I first met Chill Wills in 1953 at the Boy Scout Jamboree in Irvine Ranch, California. And he came up to our campsite and put his arm around me. Somebody took a picture of me, and for 50 years I've been trying to figure out who that was, so I didn't get a picture of myself with Chill Wills. But the most interesting thing is I'm one of the ones that showed the movie a few years ago at the Wilma. We had an original 35 millimeter reel. And before the movie, I talked to the Missoulian to get the publicity. And Mia Andrews at the time wrote a full-page story, if you remember. And after we had everything set up, all of a sudden she tells me, and we assumed that everybody was dead in the movie, that all the actors. And all of a sudden she tells me she found Vera Ralston in Santa Barbara. But it was too late to do anything at that time. We obviously would have brought her up here, paid her way up here. So we showed the movie, and we made a program, and I cut all the stuff out of the newspaper, and I got Vera's address, and I sent a whole package to her. And about a week later, I get a phone call from Santa Barbara. A guy calls me up and said, I'm Vera Ralston's husband. She wants to talk to you. Boy. So she got on the phone, and I told her, we didn't know. I didn't say we didn't know you were still alive. I didn't. But I just said we had no idea where you were, so otherwise we would have certainly invited you to come up. We'd have paid your way and the whole bit. And she had a pretty distinct foreign accent, so I got talking to her and said, where are you from originally? And she said, Czechoslovakia. And so she started telling me her story, and she was the Czech national ice skating champion in 1936. And I said, well, gee, I wrote the major photo history of the 1936 Olympics, which were held in Garmisch-Partenkirchen, Germany. And I said, how did you get to this country and everything? And she said she escaped from Prague, and she told me 1940, but I think she got her date wrong, because there's no way she could have got to this country in 1940. So I suspect she got over here just before the war started. And she came to New York and joined the Ice Follies. And then through that, she met Herbert Yates, who was the head of Republic Studios, and started doing movies and ended up marrying him. And he died at some point, and she married this present man who called me up. And she had actually skated against Sonia Henney. I don't know if you know her, who is the world's greatest figure skater. So anyhow, I said, well, I'll send you my book on the 36 Olympics. She didn't win any medals, so she wasn't in the book, but, I thought she'd be interested in it. So a week later, I get a call from her again, and she said, thank you for the book, but can you keep a secret? And I thought, well, I'm not going to Santa Barbara. I'm not probably ever going to talk to you again. She said, my husband thinks I won a medal in the 36 Olympics. And so I haven't showed him the book, I guess, and I don't want him to know about it. So anyhow, that's my link with Vera Ralston. Unfortunately, she died either last year or 2007, I believe she died. So everybody, of course, is gone now. But it was real interesting just to talk to her, and she actually was a fairly popular B-movie actress. She played with John Wayne and a few others, but they were all B-movies. She never really played in any, great movie with. But she was in quite a few movies, and you can, I think, punch into the computer and you can see all the movies she did and everything. So it's just a crime that we didn't know about her ahead of time, because if anybody went to the movie and we could have had an intermission and brought her out on stage, I think it really impressed everybody. So, but anyhow, I also have the original program from the movie, which I forgot to bring, and I also have the autograph of all the stars that stayed at the Florence Hotel. And one other quick thing, last year I bought all the stills from Tim Gordon, who deals in antiques. There's hundreds of them. And also they had a big parade for the movie, and there's one photo of her in the car during the parade. And I ended up selling them all to the Fort Missoula Museum, so they do have all the stills, and all this stuff is going to the museum at some point too. So, thank you.
And just a couple of quick comments. If anybody wants to talk about the details of the locomotive, see me at the back. I've got some books on it. And I really do mean it. Get hold of me. I'd be delighted to show you that locomotive for real.
Okay, I've got just one more thing. Some of the crew, thank God, saved our engine and moved it to the border here. There's Shorty. Who was with you? There was Ron Sines, Dick Scheimer. Was he involved in that? Smensky, there we go. Anyway, I think we owe these guys, let's hear it for these guys.
Is there any chance that you would come up and tell us a little bit about how you how that decision was made to move the train? People have wondered, why did it leave Bonner? And there's a good reason, I know. And then how did you restore it? Because it was in bad shape. Anybody want to be brave and tell us? Nobody does, okay. Yeah.
That Montana Railway donated the cost of transportation from Bonner to the museum.
And what was the route? That, it didn't cut through, go down Higgins Avenue or anything else. How did you guys get that out there?
It's from my conversations with Nicholas McKinney that hauled that. They took it right out and connected onto the interstate. Took it from the interstate right down I-90 to the Y, then turned it and brought it back to the closest off-ramp to the fort. From there to the fort, I'm not sure.
Well, they would have gone up Reserve Street, I'd imagine.
They would have to probably lift some wires up.
Go up Reserve
to get her down there.
Then wasn't much of anything, and then I guess they would have come up South Avenue.
But the actual cost of moving that, I haven't a clue. Otis, you might know, yeah.
I know that the trip from here to the Y, if you go out there and go off the interstate, go over the overpass and come back down, then you do not have to go under any overpasses. And Art Bailey there, he's got a story for that.
Art.
Sometime, but that keeps them from coming underneath the overpasses, so they can get turned around to come back.
Okay.
You know, that's why they go to the Y to do it.
Okay, Art, do you
Go
know?
off and on, back on.
Got any more to add to that?
Well, this was a champion deal.
I can add a little to the train situation. Maybe I shouldn't.
Oh,
Would you mind coming up? Art Bailey.
One of the big decisions for moving that train out of where it was at was and somebody can maybe enlighten me a little bit on how that is made, but the inner shell or the liner in between the iron was made of asbestos. And there was a decision made that we were either going to have to dismantle the train and have that environmentally cleaned up, which would have been a shame. And that was one of the big reasons why they contacted the Historical Museum out at Fort Missoula to salvage that train. It would have been a shame if they would have had to went in there and dismantle it. Maybe he can tell me more about that liner. Yeah, he'll know. Good.
Yeah, the present appearance of the locomotive, it does not have what we call a jacket on it. And the jacket was sheet metal, and between that and the boiler was what was called lagging. Well, the good ones were made out of asbestos. It was the best material for that purpose, and it should still be there. As long as it's kept encapsulated, it's not dangerous. If you misuse it, it sure is. But it is the best material for the purpose.
That jacket was falling apart, wasn't it?
Probably.
Yeah, because you notice when they showed them moving it, I was looking at it, I was like, man, that's rusty. And I realized, oh, they'd already pulled the asbestos off before it came out of Bonner, before it was loaded on the truck. That's why he was looking at, if you looked in his slides, that's why it was so rusty looking on that.
Well, the pictures that I saw here looked like it was the jacket that was rusted. Looks like it was still in place. And, you know, I am not a native of this area. I've been involved with operating railway museums since the mid-1940s. So when you're talking about how do you find the route, I've done some of that of driving trucks like that to haul locomotives and railway cars. And it's fun to find a route where you don't have an overhead clearance problem or you don't have a bridge that doesn't have enough of a load limit.
The museum got $25,000 grant to clean that up and fence it.
And you were associated with the museum at that point?
That was long gone.
Glenn or Matt, did either of you say how much the weight was of that engine and I just listed, or?
Let me pick up my sheet. I don't have all that in my head. When I talked to Glenn on the phone yesterday, the first questions he asked me were this sort of thing. And the locomotive working weight, lightweight was 150,000 pounds. The working weight, that would be with coal and water, would be 165,000 pounds. And they say full weight, that would have been really loaded up, 190,000 pounds. The diameter of the boiler is 36 inches. The cylinders are 12 inches in diameter and have a stroke of 15 inches. This was the kind of question that Glenn was asking me. This book here details all of the locomotives built by Willamette. Since they only built 33, it's possible to get it all in one book. This is the page for 7. This is the one we have right here now. $200-pound boiler pressure.
Some people were wondering about seeing the movie again, and if there's interest and we hear about it, we'll try to do that. Also, if you'd like to purchase your own copy, Mac found a source in Canada. He's got the information on the back table where you can buy the movie for about $25 on a DVD. And if 2 or more people go together, they don't charge you shipping, so maybe we could get a group of us to send our order in together. Glenn, do you have anything else for the program?
Just a final wrap-up. Since we became organized, we've established our mission statement, and it says that we want to preserve this for the entertainment value plus the educational value, because there's going to be kids coming in behind, our kids, grandkids, whatnot. They're going to want to know this, so we need to track this information. After today, got some real good details on that engine itself, who made it, how much pressure it had to have and steam to run it, what the pistons were, the bore, the stroke, all this stuff we never had before. And now we have a chance to, we'll eventually gather this information. And we have a little building down here now we can store it in. So this is mainly what our focus is as far as this group that we're getting together for now. Okay.
When I was in school in Clearwater, we saw the work train go to Woodward, and I think that would have been in 1934. And the teacher said that was a Shea engine. That work train wasn't going very fast. We got a good look at it. It's across the river from the school.
Okay. Mac, you remember what? They went about 12 miles an hour? Those old things?
Wide open downhill.
Several years ago at the national meeting of the National Railway Historical Society at Sacramento at the California Railroad Museum, we had two Shea locomotives, one from Prineville, Oregon, and one from Spencer, North Carolina, both operable. And somebody got the bright idea to have a race. Well, they didn't have two tracks where they could run them side by side. So what they did was they got a California Highway Patrol guy with his radar gun, and they ran them separately to see what they could do. And the one from Spencer got up to 18 miles an hour. Nobody thought that was possible. 10 or 12 is running wide open. That's why they have the power. They can handle grades, they can handle sharp curves and poorly built track. In West Virginia, in an area that Stan's familiar with, there's a state park where they have 5 Shea locomotives in operation. They have a lot of 11% grade. That means an 11-foot rise and 100 foot of forward motion. They have a little bit of 14.5% grade that they operate on. And because all wheels are driven, they're all small, they can do that. But the locomotive down at Circle Square here in Missoula probably is capable of speeds close to 100 miles an hour. It was a passenger locomotive. It actually operated the crack train of the Northern Pacific when it was new. And that's the difference between the two types. The geared locomotives have lots of power. They don't go very fast, but they can pull a lot, and they can do it on bad tracks, steep grades, and sharp curves.
Okay. More questions? Okay, I do have here, and I think we'd be willing to check it out. I've got a VHS copy of this. It's complete with soundtrack and everything.
When we using that soundtrack, we just didn't plug it in.
Oh, okay. You know, it's been kind of hard.
Yeah.
What we wanted to do was just point out some highlights of this, have you recognize some of the scenes and whatnot. But if you like good cornball Hollywood script, you can see it. You can buy them like we just mentioned, or I've got a couple here we could check out. And I guess we'd have to do it like a library book. We can check it out when you're done, bring it back, and then the next guy can have a crack at it until you can get your copies ordered through the mail.
Somebody wants to act as a point person. I have it on DVD as well as Good Skies of Montana.
Oh, great.
For the price of a DVD, burn them for you. Somebody wants to be the point person. You're well known here, apparently.
Well, sometimes I don't know if that's a good thing or not. Some of the things I've been known for is Oh, a little bit of the shade. Okay, well, I guess that's about all I have.
It is, as Glenn mentioned, Bonner Milltown History Center is open, so it's on the back of your sheet. Enjoy conversation, coffee. Thanks for coming. It was a great afternoon.